Yo, what is good? Nicole, how we living?
We are living good. I'm so excited to have Dan Held, and I'm wondering if he's ever been introduced with that kind of music before.
Yeah, a little hype start to the space.
I
Dan,
like
you heard
it.
that song?
It's fun. It gets the people going, you know?
It
It pump it up.
gets the people going exactly, and we got to start off with the right energy. That is very key. But Dan, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing well, just back home here in Austin, Texas. So just hanging out. Got some friends in town this weekend. So yeah, it feels good to be back here. I see Nicole everywhere. We're always traveling, going to conferences and whatnot. So it feels good to be back in town for a bit.
Yeah, well, look, we appreciate you joining us. Were you at South by Southwest? Were you enjoying that or no?
Of course, yeah. I did my rounds at the South by did my rounds at South by Southwest. We've got consensus coming up here in about a month, so that'll be big too. So yeah, it's been fun. South by is always a great time because you've got film, music, and tech, and so that's like a really cool combination.
Yeah, 100%. I had a lot of FOMO this year. Couldn't swing it, but I will definitely try and make it there next year. Austin is popping off right now in terms of the cultural vibe and whatnot. But Dan, your time is valuable, so I just kind of want to dive into some questions for you here. And because you're a Bitcoin maxi, we can start with a Bitcoin question first. How would you explain Bitcoin to a 5-year-old?
Yeah. So to clarify, I'm not really a maxi. I mean, I love Bitcoin. I think it's the most important thing in the crypto ecosystem. That's why this was all created, and especially now with like SVB collapsing and seeing these fractures in the existing financial system, we need a new money, a sound money. So for me, that's what I care about the most, and that's what I talk about the most. I'm not like anti other chains or super negative about that. For me, I think it's cool to see other chains experiment with different things. So yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of NFTs. It's been this is recently a big fan of NFTs. I don't know if anyone notices, but I've got a PFP. So first one, it's a wizard, which wizards are kind of a new hot ordinals project. For me, look, I'm an old Bitcoin boomer. I'll admit that, but wouldn't bucket myself as a maxi. But to your question, how do I explain Bitcoin simply or like in one sentence, like the elevator pitch? It really depends on who you meet. I can give a couple different standard sort of explanations, but are they old? Are they young? Is it a man or a woman? Are they from the United States or Western developed countries or not? It very much depends. So I think of it as a deck of cards. When you're playing a card game, you've got your own cards that you're holding in your hand, and then you've got the cards on the table. And so, when someone kind of displays the cards that they have on the table, that allows me to play a certain card or a certain explanation. For example, the the older boomer types, they're into they've been through a lot, and they do have a respect, and they like the tangibility of gold. They are still a physical generation. They grew up where everything was paper in the office. There was nothing digital, right? So the tangibility of gold and tying Bitcoin back to being gold 2.0, a gold 2.0 with a monetary policy that we can where we can actively audit the existing number of units. It's more divisible, transportable. It's everything gold ever wanted to be, but a digital version of that. So yeah, it really depends on who you're talking to. I think like for younger generations, it's definitely it's a fuck you money, anti-establishment sort of money, right? Like it's money that isn't controlled by a bunch of old boomers in Congress or politicians or anyone else. Like this is a money that's for the people, controlled by the people. And I think that's the really palatable narrative for Bitcoin, especially when you look at censorship of different political groups, different activist groups, different marginalized groups, whether it be racial, gender, etc. I think Bitcoin offers that truly neutral solution to allow people to transact and store value without any prejudice. So yeah, it really depends on who you're talking to, but there's a lot of ways to explain Bitcoin.
No, that was honestly great. Like, I appreciate that breakdown. But like you were saying, it's definitely interesting to see, Bitcoin, doing what it's doing now. Like you alluded to the banking crisis. Like it's kind of good to have an alternative. So we'll see what happens in the future with that. You also mentioned Taproot Wizards, though, so I do kind of want to ask you about that. Ordinals were kind of polarizing, in the Bitcoin community, to say the least. When did they kind of get on your radar, and can you also discuss the process of becoming a Taproot Wizard?
Yeah, so I've known Udi and Eric Wall for quite some time. I would call them more like Bitcoin moderates, which is like the camp I would identify with, where people are like a little bit more open-minded, especially towards like NFTs or other things like that. So was a fan of Udi and Eric's voice and tone over the years as they've become kind of like, I would call them like they equally call out Bitcoin and Ethereum maxis for their own prejudices. So I like them, and I like I like their kind of their thought leadership in the space. They created the Wizards project, which is tied back to a 2013 2014 era meme that was created in the R Bitcoin subreddit. So in that subreddit, a group of folks banded together and bought some advertisements across the other subreddits, and someone created a graphic, which is the classic wizard graphic, where that said "Magic Internet Money, come join us," and that was the that was the advertisement. We thought it was hilarious at the time. It looks like it was drawn in MS Paint. It's got a little, of course, it has more. There was more intent than just like someone creating an MS Paint in 5 minutes, but it looks like that. It's playful, funny, a little self-deprecating, where it's like, yeah, we're trying to shill you on this crazy weird thing called Bitcoin, and most people think of it as like magic internet money. That's as John Oliver puts it in his, I think this was like 2019, 2020. John Oliver had a little skit where he's like, look, Bitcoin is everything you don't understand about money with everything you don't understand about computers. And so, the magic internet money sort of mimetic capability back then was pretty funny because, Bitcoin was widely, back in 13, 14 was considered pretty fringe and weird. So definitely fit the ethos of kind of like the early builders, we're kind of quirky, libertarian, don't take ourselves too seriously types. And I think the Wizards encapsulate that. And they wanted to take that meme and kind of build upon it, where Wizards represent the kind of more moderate stance of Bitcoiners. They have fun. They're they're not hardcore maxis. They love Bitcoin, but they're DeFi curious or NFT curious, and they want to go explore other things. And they know that the world is a nuanced place. There isn't black and white. And the Wizards kind of represent this fun new community and culture to rally behind in the Bitcoin space, which I think is really cool and super fun. Um, so yeah, I'd known them for a long time, and they were like, "Hey, we're going to make you an honorary," which I was super stoked about. And they came up with this, which is, for those who already follow me, you kind of know I'm a little bit bullish Bitcoin. So just a little bit bullish. For those who don't know me, I'm, you could say I've huffed my fair share of, Bitcoin moon dust, where I'm, pretty bought in on a very, very bullish Bitcoin future. So hence the kind of the helmet and the moon. So I love it. It's really fun. It's a really fun PFP. So yeah, that's kind of the history of the Wizards, my involvement so far thus far, and yeah.
Dan, you are the GOAT when it comes to Bitcoin. Like, I have learned so much from you. Can you differentiate between a Bitcoin maxi and a Bitcoin moderate for those who may not know the distinction?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would say it's kind of being actively defined. Just like any sort of religion, you've got, like, for example, Christianity, there's multiple, there's many different, smaller denominations of like Christianity, right? You've got like Methodists and Lutherans and etc. They all still believe in the same thing. They just, have a slightly different interpretation of kind of purpose and intent. But I would say, 90% overlap of some of the core values. I would say that there's a couple really disturbing things I saw in the hardcore maxi camp that I don't understand how they possibly reconcile that with their own internal belief system. But here I'll call a few out. So, for example, they think that NFTs are scams, which, like, the over time, spending a lot of time in crypto, there has been a lot of scams across both Bitcoin only stuff. I mean, I was there through from the 2012 through 2015 era, where it was predominantly just Bitcoin stuff, and there were a lot of scams there too. There's a lot of scams in Ethereum, Solana, and NFTs, sure, but that doesn't mean that It doesn't mean that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there are scams doesn't make the whole thing a scam. And so I think a lot of them kind of do that. And that's actually a no coiner argument where a lot of people are like, well, Bitcoin's used for drugs and money laundering, therefore Bitcoin's bad. And I'm like, well, no, Bitcoin's great and it can help a lot of people. Certainly some people can use it for bad things. That doesn't make it a bad thing. So a lot of them, I think, just had a knee-jerk reaction against NFTs because of there's a lot of kind of scammy behavior going on. It was on Ethereum. And, I think that there was also this weird movement post-Saifedean. Saifedean wrote the Bitcoin Standard where, he tied Bitcoin to some cultural things that I find really bizarre, like that Bitcoin is anti-modern art. Because modern art represents fiat, and fiat money has polluted every cultural and moral value of our society. I don't disagree with some of the premise. Like, sure, it does, when you distort the underlying money mechanism, that distorts a lot of behaviors, totally. To extrapolate that to every single thing and something as subjective as art is pretty ridiculous. It's just like taking it to a whole different level that has nothing to do with Bitcoin. But more disturbingly, art or any other good or service, if someone wants to buy it and someone wants to sell it, that is a free market activity. And that is the core underlying value of Bitcoin, is that you can't censor anyone. And so the idea that they scoff or consider it a scam for someone to sell or buy something that they don't personally like, I don't know how they reconcile that with being a free market advocate. Because, yeah, I might also disagree. Like, okay, for example, let's say I own a BMW and someone has a Mercedes. Like, I'm not going to call anyone who buys a Mercedes a scammer, or consider Mercedes a scam, even if I think it's a less quality car. Who cares? It's a subjective thing, right? So that was pretty disturbing, I think, to kind of see that happen. They had some other things as well where they were anti lending. So in a knee-jerk response to poor lending standards from Celsius, BlockFi, etc., they thought that lending. Some of them refer to lending as usury, which I know you probably haven't heard that word because it's like last time someone fucking said it was 1600 AD. Usury is this idea that lending money is evil and earning interest is evil, and that it's this really bizarre, very, very feudalistic sort of perspective of money that doesn't extrapolate to the modern world. That lending and borrowing is evil, or inherently immoral, which is absolutely bananas. I mean, I don't know how you reconcile that belief with the idea that Bitcoin's permissionless, you can do whatever you want with it, and in a free market, people will choose to lend or borrow at different rates based on their risk profile and based on the lender willing to underwrite the borrower's risk. Anyways, things like this are just, I think, very much at odds with Bitcoin's core ethos of free market, free and open markets. That's the entire purpose of Bitcoin. So it's this weird, I would say, very conservative-esque perspective that's only really popped up post 2018, 2019. And so, yeah, there's other examples as well, but I think those are the two most concrete ones that require. I don't know how they possibly reconcile their beliefs, because it's in direct contrast to their beliefs about Bitcoin. So those I would consider the hardcore maxi fundamentalists. I call them fundamentalists. I don't know what the term is going to be long term, like fundamentalists, extremists, etc. And then you have more of the moderates, which are basically the original Bitcoiners, because I was there, which are open free markets, no moralization of different things. Oh yeah, also in the fundamentalist camp too, you see them persecuting sex workers for using Bitcoin. That's obscene. Bitcoin is for everyone, including people that you may or may not agree with, or enemies that you may or may not like, or people that you may or may not respect. They still deserve to use it, and I find that behavior abhorrent. So yeah, the OG Bitcoiners were very, very much in a freedom libertarian ideology of, it's very much like 3D printed guns, drugs, and Bitcoin, right? It's very kind of extreme liberty, and that's what I believe in. And I believe in permissionless, the old word permissionless finance, or DeFi is the new version of that. But in terms of narrative, these narratives have ebbed and flowed over time, but yeah, for me, I think that the moderates are, pro NFTs, for example, like myself wearing, having a PFP, pro NFTs. It's a free market behavior. If people want to belong to a community or buy and sell something willingly, who cares? And also too, I think there are some really cool things that we've seen in DeFi, right? Like being able to permissionlessly borrow and lend, or yield farm, etc. I do think, and I do agree with some of the fundamentalist maxis, where I think that, and this as a marketer, I think is an ethics thing, that a lot of these have been marketed in a way that were like pretty disingenuous, like yield farming. I mean, yield farming is not earning a yield on your assets. It's very much like actively engaging as, you know, market maker, and that's a completely different activity than earning yield. I mean, that's like selling vol. So, I think some things have been like kind of like portrayed in a way that I find disingenuous, and I do think that is an ethical thing. And that's where I might agree with the fundamentalist maxis on that. But they've taken it to an extreme where they've rejected all new ideas at all, and I think that's just not the way that this ecosystem should play out.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. And also, you kind of alluded to marketing. And I did kind of have another little piece about the wizards who are crushing marketing. And you kind of talked about the polarization between the two Bitcoin groups. It was kind of interesting to see how divisive a cartoon wizard actually was. And I kind of wanted to ask you, like, is the wizard the only NFT ordinal that you own? Are you trying to get another wizard? Are there any projects that you have your eye on other chains, maybe? Like, are we gonna see you repping an ETH PFP one day, or is that like way too?
Look, Ethereum's cool. Like Ethereum and Solana are cool. I do think that the NFT, ordinals, well, technically ordinals just refer to the ordering of Satoshis that then are inscribed upon with these NFTs, which are the, inscriptions. But Bitcoin NFTs, I do think Bitcoin is actually a superior platform to issue, control, and I would say persist an NFT collection over time. First and foremost, you actually have the asset on chain. Like the graphic file is on chain versus on Ethereum and other chains, it's a hash or it points to an IPFS file. I think that data permanence is actually a huge selling point and I would consider, I think even if you look at anyone from any sort of maxi from any chain, I think they would argue that that is a superior platform if you actually have the graphic asset on chain. Two, due to how the NFT issuance on Ethereum works, a smart contract can be updated over time and change a lot of parameters that original NFT holders may or may not, be okay with. Um, so with Bitcoin, when the inscription is inscribed upon a Satoshi, and the original collection issues the collection, and when the NFT project issues the collection or the group of NFTs, those can't be changed post issuance. So I think that that's like a really powerful selling point as well as the permanence of that, the kind of the knowing that it will always be there and that it won't be changed, which is very much along the lines of Bitcoin's ethos, reducing trust, trying to be as trustless as possible. And I think that it's really cool to see that on top of Bitcoin. And then finally, Bitcoin's the Coca-Cola, right? Like if you were a betting person and you want to bet on a chain being around in 20 years, which one are you going to bet on? Almost everyone would agree that Bitcoin, if you were to have to place a bet on a 20-year bet, that's probably what you'd go with. Look, Ethereum, Solana, these other chains are interesting, cool. I'm not trying to say that they're bad or I'm not trying to be negative, but that's just kind of how it is. I mean, Bitcoin has the longest, the strongest Lindy. It's the longest running one. If or if you want to extrapolate it further, we're at the very early ages of this. I mean, if Bitcoin works, this could be around for the rest of civilization, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, right? Like, if Bitcoin truly becomes the world's money and it's built in this permissionless way, now of course it can't scale past the solar system due to speed of light issues, but it could very well be the money for the solar system for maybe hundreds thousand years. And when it comes to, Bitcoiners think this way of like, how do we build a structure that's lasting? How do we build like an empire that can last? And so that's what I do find really attractive about NFTs on Bitcoin. I'm not ruling out NFTs on any other platform though. I'm not a hardcore maxi. I'm not just rejecting that, but I do think NFTs and Bitcoin are a superior product, because of those parameters I brought up earlier. But no, I've played around with other dApps, done yield farming stuff just to kind of mess around with that, permissionlessly lending, borrowing. I do think that we'll see a lot of that DeFi activity come back to Bitcoin, and we're starting to see it with NFTs. And I wrote about this 2 years ago. That 2 years ago I started to explore around in Solana and Ethereum, and I'm like, wow, this is really cool what you can do with any DeFi project, whether it be Bitcoin or Ethereum, Solana, etc. You've got different design trade-offs, right? Like there's different game theoretic and trade-offs that you make, whether it be scaling solutions or trust models or game theory. And so, yeah, I think each one has its own kind of unique game theory, but I do typically like some of the concepts around DeFi on top of Bitcoin, where the game theory, I think, each one has its own faults. I'm not trying to just pick which one's better, but I do think it'll be interesting to see some of that DeFi activity come back to Bitcoin. For example, with partially signed Bitcoin transactions, you can actually build DEXs for ordinals on top of Bitcoin, which is really cool. And there's actually a few working ones already, and even though ordinals have only been out for like a month and a half. So I think we're about to see a surge of developer activity on top of Bitcoin. And yeah, this is something that I've kind of seen over the last 2 years. Starting to see the things, starting to see DeFi on top of Bitcoin become a bigger reality as more people become aware of Bitcoin's capabilities, more developers start to build, and then people see the results of that building. In fact, I joined Trust Machines as their marketing partner and advisor over a year ago, and Trust Machines is trying to be the consensus for Bitcoin, building different decentralized applications on top of Bitcoin. So I think that that's really, really, it's really cool to see it happen. I mean, I was crossing my fingers and hoping that it would happen, but it's nice to be right sometimes, I guess. I've been wrong plenty of times too. So it's cool to see this all kind of play out.
It's the humility for me, Dan. I love that. I have a question. You tweeted banks are literally Ponzi schemes. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Elaborate.
Trying to be a little controversial. So a lot of people view, and some of this is in my content. A lot of what's funny is a lot of, I talked to Pete Rizzo about this. Pete is the editor in chief at Bitcoin Magazine, and I've known him for almost 8 years now, back when he was at CoinDesk, and he's an OG. And so, him and I jam on narratives and also positioning and stuff. And he's like, Dan, you're, what you are is, if you were to think about different Bitcoin educators, you're pop Bitcoin. Like you create content that appeals to the masses. And a lot of the more hardcore maxi Bitcoiners, they're like metal Bitcoiners. They only think that metal music is the only pure music out there, and they think that your message is diluted in order to get more people to listen to it. And so, with a message like that, like banks are literally Ponzi schemes, that's actually targeted towards normies, not crypto people. I know crypto people follow me and engage with the content, but messages like that, I want to reach the normies. Most normies think that the existing financial system is this super stable, trustworthy foundation, like it's fucking solid granite that is like this thing that's always just going to be there. Most people have no idea how their existing financial system works, and so these tweets are kind of prompts to jostle or shake them awake for a second, and they're like, "Whoa, I've never heard anyone refer to a bank as a Ponzi scheme." But then when you look at the mechanics of how a lot of this works, when you look at how fractional reserve banking works, or the idea that most people think that all of their money is at the bank, which is really wild. And so that's where it's meant to kind of jostle them awake and start to reconsider everything and challenge the status quo, because almost no one refers to banks that way. So I think like it's pretty wild. I've over the last 13, 11 years. I have had at least 10,000 conversations about Bitcoin, right? Like in person, dates, friends, coworkers, etc. Like individual conversations, like one on one conversations. You would be so surprised to hear, like it's interesting mimetically how these things propagate, right? Like it gives you it's really interesting. Memes are a mind virus. Once they infect the mind, it's hard to get the meme out of there. For example, most people still believe that the dollar is backed by gold, even though 50 years ago that ceased to be the case. That meme is so persistent that it's really hard to get that out. And most people are like, whoa, really? My dollar's not backed by anything? I'm like, yeah, nothing. Just pure faith and trust of the US government. And so it's really interesting, like that one. Most people don't know that how fractional reserve banking works. They think that all their money is in their bank account. Most people, believe that, you know, like they're like, oh yeah, Bitcoin. This one actually died off, which was interesting to see it die off because people would always be like, oh, Bitcoin isn't that just used for money laundering and scams? And I'm like, hey, I've got a secret for you. And they're like, what? I'm like, have you ever seen the U.S. dollar used for drugs? It's the predominant money used for drugs. 90% of all $100 bills have cocaine on them. So, it's just really funny to see those play out over time. That one's faded away. I get that less often. There's also the unit bias problem. People think that Bitcoin's too expensive because you can't buy a whole Bitcoin. The unit bias problem continually surprises me about the stupidity of humanity. Over and over and over again, I'm just blown away by the gross incompetency of just the average person, where you have the unit bias problem is a consistent one, and we see them YOLOing into unit bias problem coins all the time. Doge, Shiba Inu. When I was at Kraken Shiba, we launched Shiba, and because because it has so many units, I, I think at the time we had to go reconfigure some of our interfaces and backend architecture to handle a coin with that many units, because all the zeros that are necessary, right? So the unit bias problem continually surprises me that people fall for it over and over and over again. Let's put it this way: if I ever had a publicly traded stock, I would do stock splits for forever until the thing is like a dollar. Like I would keep it at a dollar for forever, just continually doing stock splits because people it's just very bizarre. All right, well that was a long-winded rant there.
No, and that it's honestly great, man. We appreciate you sharing your perspective. And you kind of touched on some things that I want to ask you about. Bitcoin has kind of been hot right now. I saw you tweet about this the other day too. Like Balaji predicted a $1 million Bitcoin price within 90 days. Does that mean the price of milk is going to be like $650 per gallon? What kind of world are we living in that Bitcoin hits $1 million within 3 months? And what do you kind of think about this sentiment?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, it's a marketing. I mean, Balaji is using this as a marketing message. He's not actually saying it's going to hit a million in 90 days. As you saw, it propagated everywhere. If he had spent $1 million in marketing spend, it probably would have cost him the same amount to get the reach he got. We can assume 1 million is a drop in the bucket for him, so that making Bitcoin go up maybe 1% or 2% would probably pay him back on his money. So for him, I think it was a social experiment, a marketing experiment, and pretty interesting to watch. Now, long term, I don't disagree with this thesis. I think Bitcoin represents the safest store of value that we have in this world, especially with a banking crisis like this. So when we look at Bitcoin's future value and potential, around $500,000 of Bitcoin represents Bitcoin overtaking the market capitalization of gold. I think that's a given. Bitcoin is superior than gold in almost every single fashion. And so I see that as like a very big given. Now, Bitcoin, I think, represents with DeFi and some other things built on top of it too, and a much bigger potential. And I also think that when you look at like real estate, so not only is Bitcoin competing with gold, but it's competing with real estate. I mean, real estate is the biggest store of value asset in the world at $250 trillion. We can objectively say that when you buy an apartment in certain cities or certain areas, it's the inside of the apartment didn't cost that much money to make. The building didn't cost that much money. It's the scarce land underneath it, or kind of the really heavy incentives that the government has given around real estate to hold it as an asset that have contributed to it being, I would say, one of the biggest bubbles in all of human existence is it was real estate being vastly overvalued. To live somewhere is a pure utility. I don't consider car an investment. I don't consider other things I consume as an investment. The idea that like property is an investment is kind of bizarre, and especially when you have populations eventually flatten here, which we're starting to see across most Western developed countries, then you don't have an increasing number of individuals who need to live in a certain fixed area. You've got a flat population. But in addition to that, like it's funny that innovation has occurred. Innovation has occurred across the board for any other type of good or service except for real estate, where it's like, well, I guess it'll just keep getting more expensive. Whereas like my cell phone has more computing power than the entire world in like 1985, and it cost $1,000. So it's really interesting to see how government incentives have distorted real estate as an asset. Long-winded answer to say Bitcoin competes with real estate and competes with gold, and competes with government like U.S. Treasuries as a store of value. So at a minimum, that plus like DeFi activities, you've got, I think Bitcoin's minimum market capitalization, would be many multiples of gold. So hitting $1 million of Bitcoin, I think, is a very realistic long-term price target for Bitcoin, as in like maybe the year 2030. So, 7 years from now, I think $1 million of Bitcoin isn't implausible.
Do you think that hyperinflation will be a massive problem by then as well, though? Like, will that also play into the rapid price of Bitcoin? Because I mean, it's
When
prices.
Yeah, when I say $1 million of Bitcoin, I mean in today's current purchasing power. So in a hyperinflated moment, I would consider Bitcoin to be worth maybe 10 million plus, whatever sort of inflation adjusted return that is. So $1 million per Bitcoin in today's dollars.
Gotcha. And speaking of dollars, nobody here loves fiat, but one perk of the U.S. dollar is there are no records of cash transactions. Do you worry about privacy at all if every transaction we do ends up on chain?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's always a nuanced conversation to be had between privacy and auditability. So, and this is where I find the privacy coin folks really dishonest and disingenuous and kind of pieces of shit, to be honest, because they're really fucking dishonest with this, and it annoys the shit out of me. I've blocked about 500 Zcash and Monero people because of this. So, again, it's a nuanced conversation around auditability versus privacy. And they'll never, ever, ever bring up auditability. They'll always bring up privacy. And they're like, Bitcoin sucks because it's not private. And I'm like, yeah, every Bitcoiner in the world would love for it to be completely private if there were no other trade-offs. Of course. You just think we're just saying no for no reason? It's just ridiculous. And that's why I find it so dishonest. Now, of course, I'd love to have nuanced conversations if they want to be like, cool, well, with privacy, like privacy is a fundamental human right. I'm like, totally agree. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And they're like, well, we do trade off some auditability for that. Like, for example, there's been Zcash and Monero inflation bugs that are harder to detect than Bitcoin. Bitcoin, of course, as they will dishonestly reference, back in 2010, before Bitcoin had a price, had an inflation bug, but that was because Bitcoin is like in beta mode. And was before Bitcoin is worth anything. So completely different set of scenarios and circumstances. With any sort of privacy on layer one, if you have really high levels of privacy, it impacts your ability to audit the chain. And so Bitcoin's biggest value prop is that we know for certain there will only be 21 million. And if adding privacy, which is only a small incremental, if we look at the total market capitalization of Zcash and Monero, it's minuscule. So obviously the market is not valuing that. If we were to add that and then hurt our number one value prop of auditability, that ultimately makes Bitcoin worth a lot less and decreases the network effect, which decreases Bitcoin's ability to become the world reserve currency. So obviously, I want more privacy. I don't not I want that. It's just it comes with auditability, and I don't think the Bitcoin layer one will ever compromise on that. Now, Bitcoin currently has privacy, and again, this is where they're so dishonest with that. They're like, well, coin, like for example, Bitcoin has coin joins. Coin joins are a really old privacy implementation where you can mix your coins, and it has pretty damn good privacy. In addition, Lightning adds some layer of privacy as well, as those channels between different nodes are hard to monitor and detect. And then, finally, I find the premise of privacy. If you're going to think about private transactions on top of cryptocurrency networks, let's look at it holistically. Let's be honest. Okay, let's say you've got perfect privacy on layer one with no trade-offs and auditability. So a perfect world that doesn't exist, but sure, let's say it exists. Okay, so you've got this perfectly private world, and great. You buy a car with perfectly untraceable crypto. You got to register it, right? So, and when you walk into the dealership, there's cameras, and your cell phone is tracking you the entire time you walk in and out of the dealership, and every time you Googled it, and every time you ever Google the price of whatever perfect privacy coin that is. So, unless you can operate in a world with extreme privacy, both in your physical and digital world, which, by the way, physically, you still have to pay bills physically. You got to pay bills at the grocery store. You got to pay for your electricity bill. You got to pay for, are you going to pay? Okay, so cool. You're paying for all those with your anonymous cash, but your name's on the account. Awesome, great, well, wonderful. So this utopia of perfect privacy is fucking bullshit. Of if we had perfect privacy, this is this is going to solve everything for cryptocurrency networks. No, privacy exists on a spectrum of both transacting on the network itself and preserving your privacy outside of just the network. I often ask this question at conferences too, where I'm like, okay, when I'm speaking, I'm like, quick question, who in the audience is running a mobile VPN on their phone right now? It's like 1% raise their hand. So most people won't take the steps to preserve their privacy in the most simple, easy way possible. So these privacy coin advocates think that these like basement dweller, cypherpunks are going to like somehow, somehow like avoid getting detected because they're going to like run crazy. They're going to build, they're going to have a PC that's been, has like Linux as the operating system, all this crazy shit. And I'm like, well, yeah, man, I want that too, but like it's just not plausible. So I kind of reject the premise of like privacy coins, even if perfectly private, actually solve privacy. And then I also reject their framing of Bitcoin being flawed or fundamentally wrong for not having more privacy. I think Bitcoin has made the right trade-offs and gives us pretty good privacy with coin joins and other implementations.
Cool. Yeah, 100%. That's a very, very well said, sir. And you mentioned the supply of Bitcoin, and obviously, it's not all on the available yet, and it's still actively being mined. But of the 21 million, like, how many do you think is like lost forever? Like, whether it's like sent to the wrong address, like was on a computer that was dumped in a landfill. Like, what can you kind of like make an educational guess on for how much of that is never going to be recovered?
Yeah, great question. You've got like Satoshi's hypothesized stash. We don't actually know if that's Satoshi's or not. We've got other estimations of lost coins. I mean, I don't know. It really fluctuates. There's a really pretty big spectrum. Um, Anything between, I would say, 15 and maybe 20%, I would guess, would be lost. There's some estimates that are much higher than that. Really hard to tell. I mean, you always see like these coin movements from like the 2011, 2010 era where all of a sudden a big chunk moves. But yeah, I think it's yeah, I don't yeah, 15 to 20% is what I guess.
Wow, that's kind of crazy. Not gonna lie, that a supply that's already that small could potentially have 15 to 20%. That's just gone forever. But hey, very interesting stuff. Also, this has kind of been trending as well. CBDCs are kind of getting rolled out globally. Do you think that governments will ramp up their battle against like cryptocurrencies when CBDCs are out and ready to be used?
Yeah, so CBDCs, for those who aren't familiar with them, are central bank digital currencies. Basically, the idea that instead of banking with your local bank or a national bank, you would go bank with the government bank, central bank. Um, the proponents of this are touting it as a way to reduce transaction fees and increase equality and all of that. That's all fucking bullshit. What CBDCs are an implementation of 1984-esque monetary policy and banking system where the government would have absolute control over every single transaction. What they'd likely do too is they'd launch a CBDC and also ban cash. So you wouldn't be able to use cash and you'd be stuck in the system. So with that, what they could do is they could penalize you for a tweet. If you tweet, maybe your account's frozen. And say if you tweet something negative about the government. Or if you are of a certain sort of ethnicity or racial group, you could be taxed at a higher or lower rate. They could also ban certain transactions to certain individuals, say sex workers, right wing folks, or whatever flavor of censorship was popular that day. It's a pretty terrifying proposition. It's basically the book 1984 on steroids. This is something very insidious, and they're bringing it to market as this like utopian lower fee equality solution, and it couldn't be more sinister. It's really gross to even see it portrayed that way. It's just revolting. So yeah, myself and Natalie Smolinski actually wrote up a paper, 40-page paper on CBDCs and adoption, and kind of like our thoughts on policy, our thoughts for policymakers to think through it. Yeah, there's really no benefit I see to CBDCs at all. We're going to see governments try to implement them. I think there's over 100 projects in different states right now for CBDCs. So, and what I mean by projects are like government projects of exploring or either implementing a CBDC. So it's definitely happening. Luckily, the Fed has kind of mixed views over it. Um, I think Quarles at the Fed, he's works at the Federal Reserve, had a really interesting perspective, and I thought that was pretty on point. Where he was like, "Well, faith and trust in the dollar doesn't come from its digital nature or its technology. It comes from the full faith and trust of the U.S. government." And so he's totally right. Like, it doesn't matter if they create a CBDC, that's not going to create more trust in the dollar. Then finally, he was like, well, I don't understand why we, the central bank, would take over commercial banking operations by acting as a bank where retail can deposit money. So I think that those are two great points, because as soon as you do that, you basically create a USSR style economy where basically the government has completely taken over the financial system and has absolute control over it, which is a terrifying proposition. Now, granted, with SVB collapsing and the Treasury trying to bolster confidence, with depositors, it'll be interesting to see. Maybe there's a quasi nationalization thing that occurs, maybe in Europe or another country. I hope it's not in the United States. But yeah, we'll kind of see how that all plays out.
If you had to make a prediction about how, I know you didn't want to go too much into that because I mean, who really knows? But it is kind of crazy what we're seeing in the banking industry. We've been told it's safe about 16,000 times, so it starts to make you, be a little suspect, full of maybe it's not as safe as they're saying. Like, what do you actually think is going to play out with, mainstream adoption time frame? Like a CBDCs, like they're supposed to be launching in July. Like, it's ridiculously kind of close. Like it's apparently months away. There's notifications from Watcher Guru about governments from around the globe that are apparently all rolling them out at the same time. So like, how, is this like going to happen like this year, or do you think that maybe we are a few years from mass adoption of CBDCs if they actually do become a reality?
Yeah, it's already happening, and we're just talking about the degrees of in which it's happening in which countries. So, yeah, I think I'd say within the next 1 to 3 years, we see CBDCs, really start to be used. We'll see CBDCs pushed really heavily. We'll see if the populations agree to use it, and that's a pretty well. We'll see. I really hope that populations wake up to the premise and don't buy the narrative that it's better for them and they reject it. But yeah, we'll certainly see how this all plays out. I think it's a very I think we're like I said, it's happening now, and we're going to see it happen over the next couple of years and become increasingly in the spotlight.
Yeah, 100%. CBDC is very mid. We're obviously not a fan of those here, but definitely going to keep an eye on how that plays out in the future. Are you worried about a crypto brain drain from the U.S. if the government overregulates this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the United States, in particular, represents the best form of capitalism, or one of the best forms of capitalism we have on the planet, which is about people building goods and services in a way that they can trust the U.S. system to give them a wide berth of just kind of flexibility to go take risk and build new things. And I think that it would be really sad to see the U.S. government and its regulatory agencies crack down, and that's what we're kind of seeing with the SEC. However, Coinbase is going to fight back, and I do think they have a pretty good chance of winning. I'm not a regulatory attorney. I'm not that involved, so take that with a grain of salt. But from what I hear from smart people, it seems like they've got a pretty good chance. So I think that yeah, it's something that would be really sad to see the U.S. fall behind. At the same time, if they do truly understand the game theory here of like this threatens the U.S. dollar, that's what Bitcoin's purpose is. So, maybe they do realize that, and they're like, let's try to stop it before it becomes a thing. However, I actually don't think they think it's a threat. They think it's small and irrelevant, which is actually great. They consider us to be a joke until it isn't a joke. So, yeah, I think it's really tragic to see this happening in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, aren't the government basically whales? Like, don't they have like a bunch of Bitcoin from the Silk Road? Like, anyway, like, is there some obscene amount that they've been able to confiscate from that like many years ago?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of different there's different hacks and other things that have happened. I think the coins that they're sitting on currently, but they normally auction those off. So like the Silk Road ones were auctioned off to like Tim Draper and others. But when it comes to I think the latest stash of coins that they hold belong to the Bitfinex hack. I mean, those belong to Bitfinex. So if the U.S. government wants to just seize assets and never give them back to the original owner of it, it's kind of bizarre. But I'd find it unlikely that they continue to hold it.
Nicole, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt whatever you're going to say.
I was going to say, Dan, what would you say to someone who's anti-capitalism?
Yeah, so it depends on who they are and what what other things they've said. But the way I'd start is I go, look, I agree with you that it has some characteristics that I don't find pleasant. However, it's the best of the worst. It's the best solution out of all the solutions to solving the problem of building better goods and services for people to make the human condition better. Um, I don't know of another way to incentivize people other than with money, and every form of other incentivizations have failed. And we can largely attribute the success of improving the human condition. What do I mean by that? I mean the human condition is improved by lifespan, child, like fertility, like lifespan, hunger issues, starvation issues, poverty issues. If you look at 1900 versus now, the world is a dramatically better place. In fact, capitalism works so well that people start to turn on it because it has solved their most basic primitive problems of like food, shelter, and survival. And they don't realize that without it, they were actually worried about those being problems 100 years ago, and now they can actually whine about a little bit, problems a little bit higher up on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so, yeah, I think that that's how I'd kind of describe it, and would be of I just don't know how to incentivize people outside of money to go do things. And if you look, I spent 10 years in San Francisco, and I live in Austin, which is I got a very hippie community. When you meet hippies who've lived in communes and stuff, you can ask them how socialism works on a micro scale, and most of them will agree they don't like it. They'll see that very quickly without financial incentives. You have the lazy ones, then you've got the harder working ones, and the harder working ones see the lazy ones not putting in as much effort, and eventually they stop working as hard. And so, yeah, it's just pretty easy to see on a micro level if anyone who's ever worked in either a union or a commune. You'll see pretty quickly how it destroys work ethic, and there's no incentive to become better. And then everything else kind of tumbles down from there. And then finally, capitalism and capitalism and libertarian ideology is inclusive of socialism. So you're free to go and build a fucking town where you all don't want to use money for payment. Fine, whatever. In a capitalist society, you can engage in you and other market participants who all willingly opt into it are free to engage in that behavior. We're not here to judge it, right? Like, cool. If you don't want to do that, fine. Whereas in socialism, it's inherently exclusionary of capitalism. And so that's where I think appeals to a lot of people, where it's like, wait, so which is the more moral system, one that rejects the other one or one that is inclusive of the other one? And capitalism is inclusive of socialism. For example, a lot of people are like, well, outside of like hippie communes, what's your best example of that? Families. Families are great examples of very micro socialist systems where losses and gains are socialized within a family, parents and kids, so or extended family as well. So I think that those are the ways that I would tackle that argument if someone asked me why capitalism versus socialism.
I love that. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, a lot of the "I hate capitalism" tweets are coming from $1,000 iPhones, so try to figure that one out. But Dan, if we did have a Bitcoin CEO that was obviously not Satoshi Nakamoto, but if we had to have one in 2023, we had to pick a Bitcoin CEO, who should it be?
The answer is obviously no one. There should be no CEO of Bitcoin.
Right, obviously. But let's just say, for whatever reason, Dan, like, is there one person that you think is in the leading area of thought leadership with the Bitcoin community that if you guys had to pick somebody to be a leader, is there somebody that you would name drop?
I would choose Dan. I would choose Dan.
Well,
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks. Yeah. So who's our champion? I think is what you mean. Like,
yeah, it's just kind of a meme now. Like, you have like the normal people like, hey, we're trying to get in touch with the Bitcoin CEO. Like, I think it was trending on Twitter even the other day too, as like a meme. So it's just kind of thought it would be an interesting question to ask.
Yeah, it's really tricky because, like I said before, the I'd say playbook for narrative answers to like what sort of narrative do I provide to like a millennial versus a boomer is really contextual. I probably wouldn't pick, your main champions that a lot of people have. Like I like Michael Saylor; he's great. Um, I just don't think his nuance. He doesn't have the nuance that I appreciate. Andreas was pretty good. Andreas Antonopoulos. Most people don't remember that name, but he was the biggest. He was the biggest educator and influencer in crypto from 2011 through like 2020. I'd say he kind of faded off over the last couple of years, and most newcomers actually don't know who he is. But Andreas is, I think, kind of a classic champion. Yeah, so I'd probably go with Andreas. That's like my old school answer.
Love that. Definitely check them out, guys. You heard it from Dan himself. So, Dan, you kind of mentioned this earlier too. Do you think that leaving the gold standard was probably the biggest mistake the United States has made as a country, or like one of the biggest mistakes?
Yeah, leaving the gold standard would be one of those. Also, the confiscation of gold. 60 was it? Let's see, I got it up on my wall. Let's see what is it. 6103. I forget. Yeah, the executive order to seize gold was, I think, pretty egregious breach of American values. So, yeah, I think that and the creation of the Federal Reserve would be, you know, the biggest mistakes that we've made as a country financially. The Federal Reserve has a pretty insidious mission of trying to completely control the economy, which is impossible. And we've seen it. You had Greenspan hold rates too low, too long, which created which created the financial crises of the 20th century. So it's like hiring an arsonist to put out fires, and it's just they're creating the fires, and they're like, oh well, we're actually here to put them out, and it's like, no, you created the fire too. So yeah, the Fed coming off the gold standard. I mean, this is why we Bitcoin. This is why Bitcoin exists, and why Satoshi planted Bitcoin in the 2008 financial crisis as an antidote to extremely poor planning and high risk, structurally weak sort of financial systems. And Bitcoin provides us an exit and solution to that.
Yeah, the invention of the printer as well was definitely a dark day. The Fed is absolutely their favorite toy. I kind of want to ask you as well. There are a lot of people who are still very anti-crypto. Like I'm sure you see them on your timeline. For example, like Peter Schiff. Like, what do you think it will actually take for them to open their eyes to actually using this kind of new technology? Because like they're like very much like night and day. Like we do not like cryptocurrency. We are never going to use this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to think through it. So if they're no coiner, if they're not into crypto, you start. What it really starts with is about their trust with the existing financial system. And to tell them about Bitcoin first, you first need to have them stop believing or trusting in their existing system. So you've got to plant that seed, that narrative. And so if they don't have that there, it's really hard to reach them because they're like, well, you're selling me a solution to a problem I don't think I have. Versus if they're already disenfranchised with the financial system, which actually, COVID radicalized a lot of people where they saw really poor central planning. And that was their radicalization moment. So yeah, if they have been radicalized, like they have started to distrust, play into like, yeah, I mean, those politicians and bankers, like this is the solution against that corruption and distrust of, existing systems. We don't have to trust anyone with this. And so that's a pretty powerful narrative where you're like, look, you may think that it's used for silly things, or you may not understand it, but it's a solution to a problem that you have already identified. And then, when it comes to allocation, I actually had this conversation last night where someone was like, yeah, and he was a very prominent Silicon Valley VC, and he was like, yeah, I'm just not really in, I really haven't spent time to research it and stuff. I'm like, yeah, that totally get it. I'm not gonna push it hard, because my friends, I do have this happen where at dinners, a lot of people will be like, all right, Dan, give him the pitch, and I'm like, well. I can't just, it's a little awkward to snap your fingers and give the pitch. But the way that I usually approach it, and this actually works quite well, is I first start off with going like, look, I'm not going to give you a hard pitch, and I'm not here to sell you on it. Just it makes people more comfortable knowing that I'm not going to go in at the hard pitch and that they've got to put up like a front and ask good questions. I go, look, I'm not going to convince you right now, but I go, you've got money allocated across real estate, equity, bonds, all sorts of things, right? And I'm like, you don't fully understand all of those assets. But what you know is that from a portfolio management perspective, you want to diversify your risk. And you know that a lot of smart people that you know are into Bitcoin. And you'd be remiss as someone in their 30s not to have at least 1% of your portfolio into Bitcoin. I'm like, if it goes down 1%, if it goes down 100%, you've only lost 1%. Bitcoin typically moves up in 10 to 20x movements. And if it does that now, it's 10 or 20% of your portfolio. So I usually approach it from a portfolio perspective where I'm like, look, do you fully grok every equity in your S&P 500 index? No, no way you do. There's no way you've analyzed every single equity in the S&P 500 index, but you trust that diversification works. And you know that Bitcoin has performed well. So even if you don't fully understand it, you don't fully understand these other assets. And over time, I hope you do understand it. But even if you don't, you should at least put in 1% because that's the minimum exposure you should have, especially when you can take a risk.
Definitely some good advice there. Look, we've been going about an hour, so I have one more question for you. We truly appreciate your time, sir, and the insight and perspective that you shared today. The last question I have for you is one day your great-grandchildren, they'll read your tweets, they'll listen to your spaces, they might even have your Taproot Wizard as their profile picture on a social media platform. You never know. What do you hope the world looks like for them, like in terms of the evolution of cryptocurrency, where this industry is? Also, if there's anything you want to say to them, they might be listening to this in like 200 years. So, give them a shout out.
Well, I've got to find your great grandma first, and then we'll, nature's got to take its course from there. So, um, yeah, I mean, hopefully by the time they're listening to this, Bitcoin has become the world reserve currency. Fiat currency may or may not still exist, but Bitcoin is widely perceived as like gold 2.0, and it's the safe haven asset to put your money in when, you want to safely store it for a long period of time. And I would hope too that most transactions are conducted in Bitcoin and that Bitcoin is the unit of account as well. So most things are priced in Bitcoin. People forget that when Bitcoin succeeds, it will be an extremely boring investment. Bitcoin, when it succeeds, will be like gold, where like you actually don't, I don't know when this date is, but let's say it's 20 years from now. If Bitcoin has succeeded, you may not actually want to store a lot of your wealth. You may not want to you're going to want to probably allocate your assets into more risky assets, because Bitcoin at that moment will have, maybe be $1 million a coin, but it won't have these cycles that we do now. There will be some cyclicality to it, but you probably won't see the 10x or, it might go up 20% one year, and that'll be like a big year or something like that, So Bitcoin in its final stages is like gold. It's going to be kind of this really boring asset to hold. So yeah, hopefully some of my coins have made it. Some of the inheritance has made it that far, but yeah, it'll be. I think that Bitcoin will be the world reserve currency. There'll be other chains as well, and that there'll be a lot of DeFi activity on top of Bitcoin. There'll be a lot of. I think NFTs will be a persistent thing, and yeah, I think that that's kind of my perspective of what the world's going to look like. A long time from now.
Love that. All right, grandkids, don't blow the inheritance and don't sell the Taproot Wizard. Those are the rules that you heard. And Nicole, is there any final words that you would like to say here?
I just want to say, Dan, thanks for coming on. You're the man. I learn so much from you every time. And I'm lucky to call you a friend. That's all.
Well, I appreciate the invite, Nicole, and we'll definitely we'll have some more breakfast tacos when you come out here to Austin, hopefully here soon. And Alan, great having me on. Thank you both, and thank you, audience, for listening in. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Basic Degenomics is brought to you by Hashflow, so make sure you give them a follow. We got the hash first that is releasing soon, so stay tuned for all that. And obviously, there's going to be some lovely whitelists that are going to be dropped as well. So stay tuned, everyone. Basic Degenomics is every Thursday, and we shall be chatting soon. Until next time, peace.